Shalom, this is Mary Omni from the World Government House of King David, Holy Covenant Constitutional Enforcer. This is a Republic Notice. The title of this Republic Notice is called Why Blacks Got Constitutional Voting Rights by 1870 and White Women Didn't. Why Blacks Got Constitutional Voting Rights by 1870 and White Women Didn't. It's November 2013, and in order for me to really give you a full understanding, you have to listen to several of my videos dealing with the constitutionality and voting, and then it's like the puzzle will begin to form solid in your mind and in your understanding. So one little video can't cover it all, but what I can do is cover different topics of constitutionality, and then these tidbits begin to piece together in your mind is how it should be. Why blacks got constitutional voting rights by 1870 and white women didn't. Well, for one thing, the constitutional writers and reconstructionists were about God's sovereignty and the preservation of the blood spill that carved out the constitutional cosmic contract. The preservation and the blood spill, so that the blood spill would not be in vain. Therefore, the Constitution had to have God's sovereignty to make sure the blood spill wasn't in vain. It had to be cosmically gold, platinum, Fort Knox to make sure the blood spill of this holy contract of the Ephraim and the Judah heirs would not be in vain. And since white women were consenters, they was worried that white women who were part of the Confederate, that believed in the Confederation, would wind up getting a vote and then voting outside of the interests of the constitutional God's sovereignty. And that's why, because they had already seen this in the Confederates' white man, Esau. And they saw that he was willing to do anything just to have his way. He was for immediate gratification. He didn't really care about God's sovereignty, and he was willing to sell out his birthrights just like he did biblically. And therefore, they knew that he had a woman just like him that was willing to do the same thing. And they saw a lot of these white women were very narcissistic in that they weren't even, programmed to raise their own children. They was programmed to let other people raise their children and do the motherly duties that they should have been doing themselves. So the narcissism is what they was afraid of, and they knew Esau would try to put his Edomite daughter up to try to overturn what Esau himself couldn't do earlier. So it did happen that way later on when they so-called had the white woman voting amendment, but this was far after 1870. And the title of this video is Why Blacks Got a Constitutional Vote by 1870 and the White Woman Didn't. Because the Reconstructionists and the Radical Republicans knew that a lot of these women were just left over from the Confederates that had hard feelings of losing the war, had hard feelings of losing slave ownership, had hard feelings of feeling that they could no longer have their privileges of their mammies and everything else. So it was a big game of narcissism. Now, for the good white women, or the women of the Union, what they sought to do was protect her from this type of women. So therefore, they didn't give women in general a voting amendment, because she would have ruined it all for all the women who were white, or all the women who were not non-consenters. Therefore, the 13th Amendment would serve as those who wanted to serve voluntary servitude by consent, to serve the Most High and have the protection of non-consent jurisdiction, because that's the second part and the sacred part also of the 13th Amendment, voluntary servitude by consent. And that consent would have been in constitutional protections of the Republic, and the non-consent jurisdiction, which would offer God's sovereignty that will come to blacks, that would preserve the blood spill of the Union and the Civil War and all those who fought for this Constitution. So thereby, she could have an amendment if she wanted to, as long as she served the Republic and through voluntary servitude by consent to serve the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, in his holy contract. In his holy contract, where the Judaic nation, which is the non-consenting body of the contract, would maintain the God's sovereignty to protect what we would call the holy consenters, or the Ephraim heirs. Now, she was offered a table with the Ephraim heirs, just like the male Esau was offered a table. Everybody was offered a table to be a part of this 1 through 15th Amendment holy God sovereign contract before the mule of 1871 came. Now, the mule of 1871 came a year later after 1870, after the black man's vote of non-consent jurisdiction was sealed in as ultimated supreme vote of non-consent jurisdiction as the New Jerusalem Wall. That would be a cosmic vote that could nullify any votes by anyone who decided to tread on this supreme contract, because the 1871 mule would be there blocking them. So they would have to go through the 1871 mule U.S. corporation, which doesn't have one amendment, before they can get to the 15th Amendment and begin to tread the Republic. So they can't get through by contract. They only front that they get through by contract. And what they use as the front that they get through by contract is what our Reconstructionists were scared of, that they would try to front this Edomite Esau daughter and her amendments and try to front her as having a right to abridge the black man's vote by her claiming a minority status as a majority voter of incorporate doctrines. And this is what happened. The 1871 mule went up, and then 42 or 43 years later, we had the 16th Amendment, then the 17th Amendment, which was supposed to be direct votes, but what it was a male voting amendment, see, because the male really didn't have any votes because the black man was given a vote. Because remember, the main thing the Reconstructionists wanted was God's sovereign protections. Race was the last thing on their mind. That red blood and God's sovereignty was the first one. So they left the black man with the supreme vote. So no Irish man had it, no Chinese man had it, no other white man had it. The black man had the supreme constitutional vote. They left him as the New Jerusalem Wall. So in 1871, the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, rode in on his mule to celebrate this. And then 42 or 43 years later, after the old regime of the Constitutional Republic and what they call the radical Republicans, after they pretty much died off, 42 or 43 years later, they came up with the 16th, the 17th, and all these amendments, but they are on the other side of the mule. And not only on the other side of the mule, they are 40 and 42 years later after the mule. So 40 and 42 years later, after the mule, they tried to take all these amendments that came way after the mule, 10-mile radius, and say that they're going to take the 16, 17 to 27, they're going to run right through them, then come through the mule, and then penetrate the New Jerusalem Wall. But the mule is there, and so they stopped right at there and pinned the tail on the donkey. And once they pin that tail on the donkey sees them as abominators or desolators and craps them out as dung contracts or pin the tail on the donkey. Because in order to have any amendment rights, you would have to be in the supreme contract that governs everything on this soil, including any laws, any legislation, any acts, are all governed by the 1 through 15th Amendment Bill of Rights. And that's what that mule is there to protect. And that mule protects it automatically. And the mule is non-consented to any public. That means the mule belongs strictly to the Republic, because the Republic had established non-consent jurisdiction. And then when the mule came, it came after non-consent jurisdiction was established, so it was a non-consented mule, which meaning it belongs to non-consenters. That means it served the Republic. So therefore, any amendments after this mule of 1871, which would be considered non-ratified amendments, they're not ratified by the Republic, but they are the Republic property. So they are corporate amendments which did not ratify them as being part of the supreme contract of the Constitutional Republic. Therefore, they are corporate amendments. And the corporate amendments have no jurisdictive power, have no jurisdictive authority, have no jurisdictive real vote, have no jurisdictive supremacy, have no jurisdiction of nothing. They have non-jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of non-consent, they have no jurisdiction whatsoever. They are just like the U.S. corporation with no jurisdiction. The jurisdiction is in the 1 through 15th Amendments. And the 1 through 15th Amendments is non-consent supremacy jurisdiction. Therefore, it governs the U.S. corporate mule, and it governs the 16th to 27th Amendments. So these votes that come from the 17th and the 19th Amendments are votes without any jurisdiction. Therefore, they're under incorporate doctrines, because incorporate doctrines mean you don't have no jurisdiction, okay? In order to even have corporate rights, you have to have constitutional right, because the Constitution owned the biggest mother corporation, and that's the U.S. corporation. That's the mother mule. That's the motherboard. And so the Constitutional Republic owns that. And therefore, the Constitutional Republic has the corporate rights on the 16th to 27th Amendments. So what they do in pretending as the public, because the 1871 U.S. corporation, anything came after that was the public. So what they do as the public is just basically pin the tail on the donkey, because they have no jurisdictive vote whatsoever, because they don't own the U.S. corporate mule. They are what you call subjects of the mule, and they subjects in truth of the mule anus, as they pin the tail on the donkey and pretend that they can use the 17th to 27th Amendments as a reason to trample the constitutional non-consent jurisdiction New Jerusalem wall. And when they trample only in the theory of having enforcement and guns to help them of the military-industrial complex. Had they not have the enforcement of posse comitatus of a foreign body of military-industrial complex, globalists, to point guns at blacks and put 3 million blacks in prison. See, all this was done because they wanted to act like the constitutional republic supreme contract did not own the jurisdiction of the mule and all the 16th to 27th Amendments. And so they still doing the same thing today. They put Lauryn Hill in jail for so-called tax evasion, yet Lauryn Hill is an heir that owns the 16th Amendment. So this is what I'm saying. The policing of blacks was to make sure that the military-industrial complex and the Federal Reserve can use these non-jurisdictive votes, non-jurisdictive dung votes, and pin the tail on a donkey as the cover-up fuel. Get millions and millions and millions of pin the tail on a donkey and pretend they got 16 to 27 amendment rights when they have nothing, because they have no constitutionality. And you got to have constitutionality to have corporate rights. So they gave them in corporate doctrines as dung fuel and threw them some fiat money and posse comitatus blacks whenever it's necessary to ensure that blacks don't discover their supreme contract, and to keep whites in fake privilege and whites in this strong delusion that they can overlook blacks just to get their trinkets with the military-industrial complex. And this is why the white woman did not get a vote by 1870, because they had her predicted to be the bondwoman for the bankers and the globalists to do what they did. Had she got a vote before 1870, they would have had an inroad in the contract. But the contract is supremely non-consented. Their bondwoman was kept out of it. So she became a desolation abominator contract. That's why they need so much military enforcement. Military enforcement is needed when you don't have the true contract. Jack. This is Mary Omni from the House of King David. Shalom.